The quiet hum of the starship Valor was the only sound that accompanied Admiral Jessica Phillips as she stood alone in the command center, her gaze fixed on the vast emptiness of space stretching out before her. She could feel the weight of the responsibility that rested on her shoulders, even in the relative calm of the moment. The war with the Zhen Empire had been raging for years, but lately the fighting had grown more brutal. The Zhen were relentless, and their technology was far beyond humanity's own. The Federation fleet had taken blow after blow, with each battle seeming more desperate than the last. Admiral Phillips had seen her fair share of victories and defeats, but there was something about the way the Zhen conducted themselves that troubled her. Their ships moved with a chilling precision. Their energy weapons tore through human defenses as if they were made of paper, and their commanders never hesitated to do whatever it took to win. And yet, despite all the setbacks, there was still something in her that refused to accept defeat. She believed that humans had something that the Zhen could never match, a kind of stubborn determination to survive against all odds. As Phillips gazed at the stars outside the window, she reflected on the state of the Federation. The alliance of planets was strong in spirit, but fractured in resources. The Zhen had already taken several key colonies, and their forces were closing in on the outer rim, where the last of humanity's strongholds were located. The Federation fleet was stretched thin, its ships battered and crew members exhausted, but there was still hope in the form of a new weapon, a secret project that had been developed under the radar of the Zhen. It was humanity's last hope, and Phillips had been kept in the dark until now. She glanced over at the communications officer, who had just entered the room, his expression serious and tense, a faint flicker of worry in his eyes. "Admiral," he said, "we just received a distress signal from Colony Station Delta 7. It's under attack by the Zhen. They have a massive fleet in orbit. They're outnumbered and under heavy fire." Phillips felt her pulse quicken. The Zhen were never this aggressive, unless they knew they could win. She turned to face him. "And what do we have to fight back with?" she asked. The officer hesitated for a moment, then replied, "We have the railgun prototype, the weapon they've been testing at Earth Command. It's ready for deployment, but we haven't had the chance to field test it in combat yet." Phillips stared at him as the gravity of the situation settled in her mind. The railgun, the weapon that could change everything. She had heard rumors of it, but until now she hadn't fully understood its potential. Could it really be humanity's answer to the Zhen's unstoppable forces? Phillips clenched her fists as the decision became clear. She knew the risks, but the colony needed help, and the Zhen wouldn't give up their assault without a fight. She had to make the call, and it would define the future of the Federation. Full speed ahead, she ordered, "Prepare the fleet for a direct assault, and get me the railgun. We're about to find out if humanity's last hope can make a difference." The officer nodded and rushed off to relay the orders. Phillips turned back to the view screen, staring out at the stars that had once seemed so peaceful. Now they felt like an arena where humanity's fight for survival would unfold. She had no illusions about the dangers ahead, but she also knew that if they could survive this encounter, then they might just have a chance to turn the tide of the war forever. The Valor cut through space like a blade, sharp and unwavering, its sleek hull reflecting the distant light of stars. As Phillips paced the command center, she could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. The railgun prototype had never been tested in live combat, and now she was about to rely on it in the most critical mission of the war. But there was no turning back now. The Zhen had to be stopped, and the colony at Delta 7 was counting on them. She had gathered her senior officers in the war room, discussing tactics and strategies for the upcoming assault. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone was acutely aware of the risks involved using untested technology against the most formidable force humanity had ever encountered. But there was a sense of hope, too. The railgun could change everything. They had all seen the demonstrations back on Earth. The raw power of the weapon had been enough to tear through any known defense, and now it was humanity's last line of defense. Admiral Phillips had always been a strategist. She knew that the railgun alone would not win the battle. It would give them an edge, but they needed to use their wits to outmaneuver the Zhen. The Zhen had their own tactical brilliance, and they would not hesitate to exploit any weakness they saw. She turned to her first officer, Commander Hale, who had been quiet throughout the meeting. "What do you think?" she asked. The commander looked up from the tactical display and met her gaze. "I think we need to hit them fast and hard," he said, his voice steady and confident. "But we also need to account for the fact that the Gen will be expecting us to use the railgun. They'll try to counter it. Somehow we need to keep them off balance." Phillips nodded. This wasn't just about power, it was about outthinking the Gen. She turned back to the screen showing the coordinates of Delta 7. It was a small colony, but strategically important to the Federation. If the Gen took it, they would have a clear path to other vital systems. She took a deep breath and made the call. "All right, prepare the fleet. We're going in, no hesitation this time. If the railgun works like they say it will, we'll make quick work of the Zen force." She knew the risk of failure, but she also knew that the time to second guess was over. She gave the order to engage, and the fleet moved into formation behind her flagship. As they approached Delta 7, the Gen fleet appeared on the far side of the colony, massive ships looming ominously against the backdrop of the planet. They were waiting just as expected. They knew humanity's fleet would show up sooner or later, but they likely didn't expect it to be now. With this new weapon at their disposal, Phillips clenched her fists as the countdown to the first shot began. "Target locked," Phillips heard the voice of the weapons officer in her earpiece. She nodded and gave the order to fire. The railgun was unleashed with a roar that seemed to shake the very fabric of space. As the projectile shot through the void with incredible speed, the Gen ships braced for impact, their shields flaring brightly as they attempted to absorb the blow. But it was no use. The railgun's force ripped through their defenses like paper. The first Gen warship shattered into fragments. As the projectile hit its core, the shockwave sent ripples through the rest of the enemy fleet, and for a moment there was silence in the command center. Then came the sound of the crew's collective breath being held as they realized the weapon had worked. The unthinkable had become real. Humanity had a fighting chance. The first Gen warship exploded in a violent eruption of light and debris as the railgun's projectile tore through its core. The crew aboard the Valor erupted in a mix of disbelief and exhilaration. For a brief moment, they could hardly comprehend the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. The Gen flagship was no longer untouchable. Humanity had struck its first decisive blow. Admiral Phillips stood at the center of the command deck, her gaze fixed on the chaos unfolding across the view screen. She could see the ripple effect taking place. The Gen were disoriented. They hadn't expected the railgun to be so effective, so devastating. They scrambled to regroup, but it was already too late. Phillips knew this was their chance to exploit the surprise and hit the Gen while they were reeling from the shock. The Valor surged forward with its fleet in tow, the railguns of several other Federation ships joining in as they began to target the nearest Gen vessels. The Gen scrambled to form a defense, but the fear was palpable. Phillips watched as each shot from the railgun hit its target with deadly precision. The Gen shields flickered as they failed to absorb the overwhelming force of the projectiles, and one by one their ships began to crumble. It was happening. The momentum had shifted. Humanity was no longer the underdog, they were the aggressor. But just as Phillips began to feel a sense of control, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. A massive Gen ship appeared from the depths of the formation, a heavily fortified vessel much larger than anything the Federation had ever encountered. Its hull was lined with energy shields, and its weapon systems were unlike anything the Federation had seen before. The Gen had clearly prepared for this moment. They had known humanity would bring its new weapon to bear, and they had come ready. Phillips knew they couldn't rely on the railguns alone this time. They would need more than firepower. They needed strategy. She quickly called for a tactical meeting to discuss their next move. Commander Hale was already on top of the situation. As he entered the war room, he wasted no time. "Phillips, we've got a problem. That ship, it's too well defended for our railguns to make a difference. Not without a new approach. The Gen flagship is built to withstand direct hits." He explained, "We'll need to take a different angle. We can't just go in headfirst. They'll pick us off one by one." Phillips nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. The Gen flagship had superior firepower and shields, but it had to have a weakness somewhere. She scanned the available intel, and her eyes landed on a potential vulnerability. If they could get close enough to the flagship's aft section, they might be able to exploit a gap in its shield systems. She made the decision without hesitation. "We're going in. We can't let them regroup and counterattack. We hit them where they least expect it." The fleet adjusted course, Phillips barked orders, and the ships split into a new formation designed to outmaneuver the Gen flagship. The Valor led the charge as they approached the Gen's rear flanks. Their sensors scanned for weaknesses. The Gen flagship responded quickly, shifting its formidable defenses to cover its vulnerable rear, but Phillips had anticipated this. She ordered the fleet to feint a full-on assault from the front, then to immediately pull back and reroute toward the rear. Once the Gen flagship had adjusted its shields, she knew they would have a window of opportunity, but it would be tight. They had to move quickly. The seconds ticked by like hours as Phillips watched the distance close between the Federation fleet and the Gen flagship. The tension was unbearable for the crew, but Phillips felt a strange calmness as they neared the critical moment. This was what they had trained for. This was the moment that would define humanity's future in the galaxy. The Valor and its fleet moved swiftly as they began their feint toward the Gen flagship. The plan was risky, but Phillips knew it was their best shot. They couldn't just brute force their way in. They needed to outthink the Gen and create an opening before they could reconfigure their defenses. The Gen flagship loomed ahead with its massive shields pulsing in the darkness of space, but Phillips was confident that they could exploit the small window she had calculated. The fleet began the initial assault from the front. Phillips watched closely as the Gen flagship responded, shifting its powerful shields to protect its vulnerable rear. This was the moment she had been waiting for. All their calculations and strategy had led them to this very instant. The Valor and the fleet quickly broke off and veered toward the rear of the flagship. Just as Phillips had predicted, the Gen flagship was momentarily caught off guard. The shields at the rear were weak, and its defenses struggled to reposition quickly enough to counter the new threat. Phillips felt a surge of adrenaline as she saw the opening she had been waiting for hit them now. She ordered the fleet to concentrate fire on the rear of the flagship. As they moved in fast, the railguns fired one after another, each shot hitting the Gen ship's rear hull with precise accuracy. The Valor's railgun unleashed a barrage of shots with devastating force. As the Gen flagship began to tremble from the blows, the massive warship tried to retaliate, but it was too late. The Federation fleet was already on top of them. The Gen flagship's shield systems began to flicker under the intense bombardment, and the rear sections of its hull started to buckle. The crew of the Valor held their breath as they continued to fire. It was the turning point. The Gen flagship had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt and respond quickly. Phillips could see the Gen fleets starting to lose cohesion. Their massive warship was their center of strength, and if it fell, the rest of the fleet would likely fall apart too. But just as victory seemed within reach, the Gen fleet's desperation turned deadly. Phillips watched as the flagship began to release its own countermeasures, launching waves of small fighter ships to intercept and harry the Federation fleet. The Gen ships began to position themselves more aggressively, trying to create a wall of defense around their flagship. The Gen had anticipated a direct assault, and now they were going to make the Federation pay for it. Commander Hale spoke urgently over the comms. "Admiral, they're closing in on us. We can't stay here for long. If we get surrounded, the railguns won't be able to break through their shields. We need to break off and regroup." Phillips didn't hesitate. "No, we push forward. We can't let them recover." She knew they had to press the advantage now or risk losing the momentum they had built. The Gen flagship was faltering, but their counterattack was just as fierce. She ordered her fleet to tighten their formation and continue the assault, focusing on the areas where the Gen shields were weakest. The Valor surged forward as more railgun shots found their mark, striking deep into the flagship's rear section. Each strike seemed to shake the massive vessel even further, and Phillips could feel the pressure building. The Gen flagship was on the brink of collapse, but there was still time for the enemy to retaliate, and with every second they wasted, the Gen fleet was regrouping and getting stronger. Phillips pushed on, refusing to back down. The fate of Delta 7 was in their hands, and she wasn't about to let humanity's last chance slip through their fingers. The Valor surged forward as the battle raged around them. Phillips watched through the view screen as the Gen flagship staggered under the relentless barrage of railgun fire. Each shot from the Federation fleet struck with deadly precision. But despite the damage, the Gen flagship refused to fall. It continued to retaliate, launching wave after wave of fighter ships and smaller warships to swarm the Valor and its fleet. The smaller Gen vessels darted through space, in tight formations, their weapons lighting up the darkness with deadly intent. Commander Hale's voice came over the comms. "Admiral, we've got multiple Gen fighters closing in on us. They're trying to get in range for a bombing run. We need to break off and deal with them before they get too close." Phillips's eyes flicked to the tactical display. She could see the fighter groups approaching quickly. They were fast and agile, but not as powerful as the capital ships. The Federation fleet could handle them if they acted quickly, but Phillips knew that every moment spent chasing these fighters meant less focus on the flagship. She gritted her teeth and made a snap decision. "All ships concentrate fire on the fighters. Clear the skies," she ordered as the fleet adjusted their formation to focus on the smaller Gen ships. The railguns began to fire in rapid succession, cutting through the oncoming swarm of fighters. One by one, the Gen ships exploded into fireballs as the Valor's railgun took out the largest threats. But the Gen were relentless. They kept sending more waves of fighters, and it was becoming clear that the Gen were willing to sacrifice their smaller ships to buy time for the flagship to recover. Phillips felt a surge of frustration building. She knew this would be a battle of attrition. The Federation fleet had the firepower, but the Gen had numbers, and the resolve to keep sending reinforcements. Even as their flagship took damage, the flagship itself seemed to be on the verge of collapse, its shields flickering as more of its hull buckled under the onslaught. But it wasn't enough. The blast from the Gen flagship sent shockwaves through the Valor. Its hull groaned, and the ship shuddered under the violent impact. Alarms blared throughout the command deck, and the crew scrambled to respond to the emergency systems. Phillips gritted her teeth as she pulled herself back to her feet. The force of the explosion had sent her sprawling, but she refused to show any weakness. She had seen worse, and she knew her crew needed her focused now more than ever. Commander Hale's voice came through the comms. "The Valor's shields are critically low, Admiral. The damage is extensive. We're going to lose power in the next few minutes if we don't take evasive action." Phillips's eyes narrowed as she watched the tactical display. The Gen flagship was still holding strong despite the damage. Its energy pulse had temporarily disabled several of the Federation ships, but the Valor had taken the worst of it. Their shields were all but gone, and the hull was beginning to show signs of stress. Phillips knew they couldn't keep fighting like this. The fleet was losing its edge, and the Gen flagship was still a major threat. If they didn't act fast, they would be wiped out. She turned to Hale with a commanding voice. "We need to buy some time. I want all remaining ships to form a defensive perimeter around the Valor. Protect it long enough to make a retreat," she ordered. The commander hesitated for just a moment, but then nodded and relayed the orders to the fleet. The remaining ships of the Federation fleet moved quickly into position, forming a tight defensive circle around the Valor. The Gen were relentless, though they regrouped quickly and began pushing forward with all their remaining firepower. Their smaller ships continued to swarm the perimeter, and every shot from their weapons seemed like it could be the one that finished them off. The Valor lurched again as another volley of enemy fire slammed into the ship's exposed hull. The damage was starting to become overwhelming, and Phillips could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. The crew was exhausted, and the fleet was on the brink of collapse. They needed to retreat, they needed to survive and regroup, but she couldn't afford to let the Gen flagship escape. They had come too far to let that massive vessel slip away. She looked at the tactical map again, and then back at the Gen flagship. It was still limping along, barely holding itself together, but it wasn't backing down. Phillips took a deep breath and made the decision to take one last chance. If they could just cripple the Gen flagship, they could buy the fleet enough time to retreat and regroup. "All ships," Phillips ordered, "prepare for a final strike. We go for the flagship's engines. Focus all firepower on its propulsion systems. We can't let it escape." The remaining ships readied their weapons and began targeting the Gen flagship's exposed engine sections as the Valor fired its railguns one last time. Phillips watched in silence as the shots sped toward their target. The remaining Gen ships swarmed in to protect the flagship, but the Valor's firepower tore through their defenses. The first shot hit the Gen flagship's engine core with an explosion that lit up the dark void of space. The flagship shuddered as its engine sputtered, and then faltered. The second shot hit even closer to its heart, and with a deafening screech of metal and power, the Gen flagship's engines erupted in a massive burst of energy. The core of the ship began to destabilize. Admiral Phillips watched as the massive Gen flagship began to crumble under the onslaught, its shields faltering, and its propulsion systems failing. The once mighty warship was now in a death spiral. The Gen flagship was finally defeated. The Gen flagship's engines began to explode in violent bursts of energy. The massive warship rocked and shuddered as its propulsion systems failed. It was clear now the ship was finished, but the Gen fleet wasn't done yet. They were desperate, and they fought with everything they had left. Phillips's breath caught in her throat as the remaining Gen ships poured fire into the Federation fleet, their weapons flaring brightly in the blackness of space. The smaller Gen ships continued to swarm, their guns blazing. Their goal was clear. They were trying to take down as many Federation ships as they could before the flagship finally fell. Commander Hale's voice crackled through the comms. "The fleet's taking heavy damage, Admiral. We can't keep this up much longer. We need to fall back and regroup." Phillips clenched her jaw as she watched the chaos unfolding on the screen. The Valor was still holding on, but barely. The remaining ships of the Federation fleet were struggling to defend against the Gen onslaught. They were already battered, and their firepower was dwindling. The Gen fleet was pushing them further into a corner. Admiral Phillips glanced at the screen once more and saw the damaged Gen flagship still attempting to regroup as its hull started to disintegrate under the barrage. The Gen fleet's desperation was evident. They were trying to save their flagship at all costs, and in doing so they had made a critical mistake. They had overextended their forces. Phillips's mind raced as she analyzed the situation. They were in range. If they could push forward just a little further, they could wipe out the remaining Gen ships and end the battle once and for all. She turned to Hale with determination. "No retreat," she ordered. "We finish this. Now all ships focus fire on the remaining Gen fleet. No distractions to it now." She commanded. The ships of the Federation fleet hesitated for a brief moment, but they followed their orders. The remaining ships adjusted course and opened fire in a coordinated effort. Their railguns lit up the darkness as each ship fired at the swarm of Gen vessels. The force of the fire tore through the Gen lines, and the smaller ships exploded into fragments. The Gen fleet was beginning to collapse. Their fighters and smaller ships were being obliterated one by one, but the remaining warships continued to fight back. With sheer determination, they had lost their flagship, and now they were losing their fleet, but they refused to yield, and they kept firing in defiance. Phillips gritted her teeth and pushed forward, determined to end this battle before the Gen could regroup. The Valor led the charge as it tore through the Gen fleet. The railguns, continuing their deadly work, ships around them exploded in flashes of light, and fire debris floated through the void as the Federation fleet carved its way through the remaining Gen warships. The Gen commanders were frantic. They had no time left. They had underestimated humanity's resolve, and now they were paying the price. Phillips watched as the last few Gen ships broke apart under the intense firepower. The enemy fleet was no more. Only scattered debris and wreckage remained in the wake of the Federation fleet's advance. The battle was won, but it had come at a terrible cost. The Federation fleet had taken significant damage, and many ships had been lost, but the Gen fleet was utterly defeated, and the galaxy had taken a monumental step toward victory. Phillips allowed herself a brief moment of relief. The Gen flagship was destroyed, and the remnants of their fleet had been scattered, but the war wasn't over yet. This battle had been a turning point, but there was still more to come. And she knew that humanity's greatest challenge was far from finished. The debris of the Gen fleet floated through space. In the aftermath of the battle, the Federation fleet had won, but the victory felt hollow as the ships began to slow their momentum and regroup. Phillips stood on the command deck, her eyes fixed on the wreckage outside the view screen. The Valor had taken serious damage, and many of the ships in the fleet were barely operational, but they had survived, and the Gen fleet had been decimated. For now, humanity had won a crucial victory, but Phillips knew that the war was far from over. Commander Hale approached her. He was covered in sweat and exhaustion, but his face held a look of grim satisfaction. "Admiral, we did it. The Gen flagship is gone. Their fleet is shattered," he said. But Phillips knew better than to celebrate too soon. The Gen were ruthless, and they would regroup. They would learn from this defeat, and they would come back with a vengeance. Humanity had just taken a major step, but the war was still looming large over them. Phillips nodded slowly, her thoughts running in 1,000 directions. The fleet had lost too many ships and too many men, but they had delivered a powerful message. The Gen could be defeated if they stood together and fought with everything they had. Humanity had proven itself capable of taking on the most powerful empire in the galaxy, but at what cost? She looked at the tactical screen once more. The remnants of the Zen fleet were scattered across the battlefield, but there was still no sign of retreat. The remaining Gen warships were trying to regroup in deep space. They had pulled back for now, but Phillips knew they were not done. They would come back. They always came back. Phillips felt the weight of the decision ahead of her. The Federation fleet was in no condition to press the attack. They needed repairs and resupply, but she knew that the Gen would regroup, and it wouldn't take long for them to strike again. She turned to Hale. "We need to prepare for the next phase," she said firmly. "We can't wait for them to make the next move. We go after their supply lines, we cut off their reinforcements, and we keep the pressure on them. They'll be forced to retreat, and we'll make sure they never come back." Hale nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll begin preparations for a counteroffensive." Phillips watched as Hale walked away to carry out the orders. She turned back to the view screen and took a deep breath. Her fingers lightly touched the edge of the command chair. She had led them through the first great battle of this war, and humanity had come out victorious. But the next fight would be harder. The stakes would be higher, and the cost even greater. She was prepared to lead her fleet through it. Whatever came next, humanity had taken the first step toward victory. But Phillips knew that they couldn't afford to let their guard down, not for a moment. The war had only just begun, and they had to keep moving forward if they were to survive, and if they were to win. As the Valor began its slow journey back to the Federation's base for repairs, Phillips stood at the helm, ready to lead her crew into the unknown future ahead. They had proven that humanity could hold its own in the stars,